from the Mayor's Office of Sustainability. We've asked them here today to talk about what it is you do and how this impacts Lower Manhattan specifically, and what good things are in store for sustainable efforts down here in Lower Manhattan and CBM.
Excellent.
Thanks for coming.
My pleasure. Where should I?
Wherever you like, I'll just give you this pointer.
So let me introduce, first off, let me introduce myself. I'm Michael Shake. I am the Strategic Initiative Director for the Mayor's Office of Sustainability. You guys have probably, well, I know many of you have seen me in my previous role when I was at the Resiliency Office. I've jumped over to more of a policy job with my colleague Lindsay Page here. Doing less external affairs, more getting in the weeds of the strategy behind our sustainability work. Sustainability doesn't have an external affairs director, so you get me. Plus, I miss my old friends at CB1, so wanted to come talk to you guys. So very quickly, the Mayor's Office of Sustainability, we focus on the other side of the climate change coin, where the Resiliency Office focuses on all of the risks of climate change, like sea level rise, storms, increased heat, the things that are already locked in. That's that one side. On the other side, we are working on the mitigating our problem, to our contribution to climate change, so reducing greenhouse gas emissions. That's our main focus. Let's go. So this is the Mayor's Office of Sustainability's charge. We're helping the city become the most sustainable big city in the world and being a leader in the fight against climate change. And that last part I want to explain a little bit of why it's important is because I'm going to get into our Paris Agreement work, but with President Trump pulling the United States out of the Paris Agreement, it has been more and more incumbent upon cities and states to take up the mantle of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. And as we found in our work over the few years, whatever New York City does tends to, blaze the path for other cities. And we're seeing a lot of other big cities in the country starting to take up some of the things that we're doing. So that's why we are trying to be one of the global leaders here. That's also how we look at things. Climate change is an existential threat, but it's not acceptable. But we do not accept that it's inevitable. So how does the office work very quickly, just so you know? We are divided into 4 teams, focused on what we've broken down into kind of 4 strategic pillars of addressing the problem: buildings and energy efficiency, infrastructure and energy, strategic initiatives, so I'll get into in a second, and marketing engagement. The building side, very quickly, is focused on reducing greenhouse gases in buildings. Most of New York City's greenhouse gas emissions, its carbon comes from buildings, 70%. So we have a very large team that is focusing on reducing our greenhouse gas emissions emanating from buildings and focusing on how to make these buildings operate more efficiently. I don't want to... our skyline is beautiful, but when you think about contribution to the problem, they're like cigarettes, essentially, with the way that they're emitting everything into the air and contributing to our poorer air quality. So we're really focused on reducing that, and I'll get into that in a second. Energy and infrastructure, that is looking at our electric grid. It is looking at how to make that cleaner. It is looking at how to bring more renewable energy into the electric grid so that we're using renewable energy and not fossil fuels. We have a whole team focused on that. Strategic Initiatives is a team that I run, and that is focused on reducing greenhouse gas emissions from things that aren't the grid and aren't the buildings. So it's looking at plastics, for example. It's also helping to look at electric vehicles and charging infrastructure. We're looking at sustainable consumption issues around food as well. And then finally, marketing and engagement. That's kind of a fancy way of saying building partnerships and communicating with the public on ways that they can change their personal behavior. All these things kind of link together, but that's how we've broken it down. Actually, maybe you've seen, let me just quickly on marketing engagement, you've probably seen Birdie, our mascot. Maybe not. All right, the water bottles.
Oh.
Maybe. Okay. Anyway, let's run out of that team. It's Green NYC. So our major kind of policy.
Isn't Green NYC a nonprofit?
Green NYC is run out of the mayor's office. It's it's an effort we have to engage New Yorkers directly about how to make personal behavior change, like around using recyclable bags, taking more transportation, or cleaner transportation, changing light bulbs, more efficient light bulbs, things that, like the little things that we can do to change your behavior that add up to kind of the bigger effort. So in terms of the overall policy, I'm going to spare you the text here. Again, going back to President Trump a couple years ago pulling the United States out of the Paris Agreement, we said, nope, that's not going to happen here in the city at least. We are going to still stay committed to the Paris Agreement because it was the right thing to do. The planet needs it. So we took all of our climate change efforts and looked at them against the Paris Agreement and looked at where we could align them with the goals of Paris. Now, obviously, the Paris Agreement is a global compact. We don't have that kind of jurisdiction, but what we can control, we're trying to control and aligning that with the Paris Agreement to drive down our carbon emissions. The city has a goal of reducing carbon emissions 80% by 2050. The Paris 1.5 degree, the goal 1.5 degrees Celsius. It's the goal to keep warming to only 1.5 degrees Celsius, which roughly translates to about 3.2, 3.1 degrees above current levels. So we've aligned all of our strategies, buildings, waste, transportation, you name it, to drive down carbon emissions in line with this goal, which is approximately the 80 by 50 goal as well. They do align in that way. So, just very quickly, we're on this, this path here, we have to get down to this 80 by 50 hashtag line here that is reducing our carbon emissions there. And I'm going to go through some of the actions we need to take by 2020 to get us to that. So these are the kind of things that we're going to have our office is focusing on, which are going to benefit, which are going to have more citywide benefit in terms of reducing greenhouse gas emissions. Unlike the resiliency work where you can build coastal infrastructure in a specific geography, the work of the sustainability office is naturally more citywide. The benefits were built with buildings. What we do in Lower Manhattan, everything that we do citywide is going to affect Lower Manhattan. It's going to affect the Bronx. It's going to affect the Rockaways, or it's going to affect Staten Island. There's very little we can do to reduce greenhouse gas emissions locally, so we're focusing on the citywide efforts. But I'll get into some of the stuff that we're going to be doing down here. But the first big thing, maybe some of you heard about it, is our big effort to mandate carbon emissions from big buildings. It's a piece of legislation that's working its way through the city council right now. We understand that it'll probably be up for a vote sometime in the next couple of months. We're looking April, maybe later, depending on how negotiations go with community advocates, other stakeholders between the city council and the administration. But this is a landmark bill that will set greenhouse gas emissions limits for buildings over 25,000 square feet. And so it'll set a couple of targets. Right now, I think that the dates for meeting these limits are, I want to say 2022 and 2024. I think those are going to be negotiated and pushed out a little bit, but the main point here is that there are going to be targets that big buildings are going to have to hit to drive their emissions down to help us keep on this 80 by 50 path. We've already passed some pretty advanced building codes, so all new construction in the city for buildings are going to have to be more sensitive to carbon emissions, be more energy efficient. We're looking at how to bring 100% renewable electricity for city operations. That's something we have control over when it comes to renewable energy. Often New York City, we think of ourselves as the whole that other people are a part of, but when it comes to renewable energy, we are a part of the whole, which is New York State. New York State has a great deal of jurisdiction over how our energy is produced and how it comes into the city. And I'm going to talk about that in a second. But where New York City has a jurisdiction to control the things that we can do here locally, we will. And that's looking at how to get 100% renewable electricity for capital C, the city government operations, which is quite big. It's quite big. It's a lot of buildings that we own. We're pushing out electric vehicle infrastructure, the charging stations. We can't buy electric vehicles for people, but the federal government has EV incentives. But what we are trying to do is encourage people to think about, if they are going to buy a car, we'd like you to use public transportation if you could, get more cars off the street. But if you are going to buy a car, make sure your next one is an EV, and to help encourage people to make that decision easier, we're starting to build more EV charging stations. So it'll be easier to make that transition. Sustainable transportation, again, stuff around the MTA. We all know the debacle around that, but we've been trying to push on getting more sustainable forms of transportation, not just with the MTA, more bike lanes, more cleaner buses with the state, and we're looking at, I think there's a bill right now looking at piloting electric school buses as well. So these are all things that are going to be in organic separations, zero waste, right? Less waste to landfill, less greenhouse gas emissions from waste. So that's part of the equation here to help bend this curve down to 80 by 50. Here are some of the other things. Go ahead. Question.
Do you have a sense of what each one of those actually does for the curve? How important each one is?
Sure. Yeah. Building mandates are by far the single biggest thing that the city can do. 70% of our carbon emissions comes from buildings. The vast majority that come out from big buildings, and so anything we can do to regulate greenhouse gas emissions emanating from buildings and making them more building efficient. New buildings that we have to build, making them more energy efficient. I forget the statistics, but I think the vast majority of buildings that are here now are going to be here in 2050, and then 2100. So it is about our existing buildings that we really have to clean up and retrofit. And then when we get a chance with new buildings that are being built, making sure that they are very energy efficient and low carbon. So that's the biggest thing. Transportation and waste are the next two components. But New Yorkers, by nature of having the subway, we're one of the lowest carbon per capita populations in the country. We have some of the lowest carbon footprints. Here are some of the other things that we need to do pretty quickly in the near term to help bend that curve down to get us to 80 by 50. I can't underestimate climate change communication. Luckily, we're actually seeing that happening at the federal level. I think that with some of the new politicians that we've seen taking over in Congress, we've seen some of the young student movements are actually helping with this and getting this, whether or not you agree with the Green New Deal or not, we're hearing that this conversation is in the public. We're seeing more and more presidential candidates now focusing on climate change and communicating the urgency of this problem at the federal level, state, and here at the local level. We are going to be wrapping up our efforts to communicate to New Yorkers more clearly about the individual changes that we can make in our own lives. More to come on that. You'll hear about that later, and when those announcements rolled out, I'm happy to come and talk about that as well. Workforce. one of the nice things about the building mandates that I talked about earlier, that is going to create about 14 to 15,000 new jobs. We need to be able to, we're setting up programs to train people to do this new type of climate work. There's some special skills that are involved in terms of for electricians and plumbers and architects, things that we're having to train a new generation of New Yorkers to make sure they have the skills for the future and the new green
Can you be
economy.
specific about what you're talking about? Or are you gonna get to that?
I'm going to get to that.
Okay.
Okay. Well, actually, I just talk right here very quickly. Particularly with the building mandates are going to require a whole bunch of work in terms of retrofitting buildings and upgrading boilers, electrifying buildings. We're getting there's 14,000 jobs these are going to create, so we have to really train a whole new generation of people to do this work. So our workforce development programs through our Green Jobs Corps are going to be ramping up to make sure we get people in the pipeline that are trained to do this work.
So are there tax deductions for landlords to do that work, or?
So, good question. PACE financing, which we're going to get to.
Okay.
PACE financing is a piece of legislation we're working at the council with. Currently, it's a complement to the buildings mandate. It is long-term, low interest financing for this type of building efficiency and energy efficiency work. The PACE financing it exists in other parts of the country. It exists in New York State, but not in New York City. The city council has to pass enabling legislation to allow banks to be able to offer this type of financing. It's private financing. The big banks are going to do it, but they're all very interested. We are going to pass that legislation to enable that type of financing, hopefully very, very soon. And so it's going to unlock a bunch of financing for the building retrofit.
Wait, and what does PACE stand for?
PACE stands for Property Assessed Clean Energy financing. So essentially, it puts money back on your property bill. It's financed through your property bill. Yeah. So vehicle efficiency, I got over. Vehicle efficiency, I went over with EVs, and then new technology we need to bring into the city. We're piloting a program in Staten Island very soon to get air source heat pumps into homes, which are very environmental friendly. We want to make sure that more technologies like this are brought into the city. So trying to spur the market and create markets for these cleaner technologies. So here's I'm going to get into some of the longer term stuff about large scale renewable energy. Go ahead.
You had mentioned that federal, state,
Yeah.
blah blah blah. So you're here with us,
Yeah.
right? We're the community board. We're not the most local, but we get pretty local,
Yeah.
right? So, is there a feedback mechanism? Because it's always great to hear these initiatives, and then often there's some real inefficiencies,
Sure.
or there's some real mistakes that get made, and then once the sort of bureaucratic, with all good intentions, the train leaves the station, it's very hard to then adjust things, or people get egg on their face, there's all that sort of momentum that becomes very hard to give proper feedback once the program starts being implemented, when we find out what's wrong.
Sure.
When we find out
That's a good point.
So can you bring this back and build in some sort of mechanism whereby we get to give you comments that are actually going to have some teeth or matter as this rolls in? Because we're going to be the best way for you to deliver
100%.
if you let us.
Yeah. Is there anything that I mentioned, like is there any specific initiative that I mentioned that you like?
Well, I want to know that there's some, in the legislation or in the structure of the rollout, that there's going to be this really heavy community feedback loop where there's levers that you can pull to change things?
So, yeah, good question. A couple of examples, particularly with the buildings mandate. For big buildings are 25,000 square feet and over. We've built in a community advisory task force that will be legislated, that will allow for academics, professionals, community, elected officials to be on this, to help look at the bill to make sure if the targets are set properly, if there need to be fine tuning as we go along. This is a bill to get us to 80% reduction by 2050, so there's a 25, 30-year horizon, so we need to check in constantly to make sure that's working. LP, my colleague here, Lindsay Page, is leading a very big effort with the Department of Transportation to do community outreach with elected officials, with community boards about where we put EV charging stations and curbside charging. So we try as much as we can from the beginning to bake in community feedback, also talking to your elected officials. So anything we can do, you're now in touch with me. This is the first time that I've come here. Sustainability offices focus very much citywide, but we're getting more granular as we move forward. So you're going to have my information, so you can always get a hold of me and my team, and I can connect you to the right people.
But you know, I think that speaks to when the legislation is being written or when the programs are being, thought of and before implementation. But once implementation starts, is when the community actually gives you feedback, or when there's a chance for real feedback. And at that point, is there any mechanism to guide the monster a little bit, And
there's this mechanism, which you call us up and come talk about the program. There's your elected official. There's always coming to city. There's always calling City Hall, right? Now I understand.
Well, we know how effective that
I
can
know.
be.
And I was just gonna get there. I totally understand. I would say that your elected official on this one, like, go right to them for feedback. But there's also, on any program you have that's related to sustainability, your community board one is welcome to call me anytime, and I will come here and I'll talk about it, or I'll make sure that the right agency gets here.
But you might move on in 10 years.
But my office is not moving on in 10 years, and I will make sure. We'll make sure that Anthony, your chairs, we'll make sure.
Let's just, that's a great question, just let Mike finish the presentation.
All right, so
we'll hit him up
I'm
with
almost to
questions.
the end. One of the big things that we need is more renewable energy, and a lot of it. Right now, we have our energy mix is well over 50% for fossil fuels. It's natural gas. Indian Point, the nuclear power plant upstate, provides us a lot of energy. It's also carbon free. We have some solar in the city with some pretty aggressive solar goals, but solar is not going to get us all the way to 100% renewable, or to 80 by 50. So here to talk a little bit about what we need and some of the constraints and where we're going to be, where the city's going to be focusing its effort and advocacy. So one of the things that we need here in the city is new transmission. It's basically a big extension cord from point A to point B. Most of the renewable energy that New York City is going to need is going to have to come from upstate, or it's going to have to come from offshore wind. And in order to get that here, we actually have to build and finance and build transmission. That is not in New York City's jurisdiction to be able to do. It is mostly a state and federal issue. We are intensively, I had to sit right next to the New York City's top official that works on this issue, and I can tell you how hard her and her team are working to get the state and get the federal government involved in helping get more transmission. We have a bottleneck to bring that power down. The governor has just started talking. He's expanded the amount of offshore wind he wants to build for New York State from 1,200 megawatts to 3,600, which is don't quote me, but probably about 2.5 nuclear power plants worth of offshore wind. But to bring that onshore, you it's very expensive to build those transmission lines. So we're working with them to make sure that they build it, that the costs of that are associated across the state, not necessarily borne entirely on New York City ratepayers. It's a very big thing that we do to make sure that our energy remains affordable. And then secondly, distributed energy resources is a fancy way of saying solar plus battery storage. Solar is pretty ubiquitous across the country. What is not so great is the availability of battery storage and also the size of batteries in order to store that power that solar is being created when we're not using it on cloudy days or when we're not at home on the weekends. So we're really pushing very hard to bring that technology to the city, to let other people know that we really need it, to scale it, and really push out the incentives for solar. We run a couple programs, one by the name of Solar Rise, which is really focused on bringing solar to low-income communities in New York City in order to cut local air quality benefits, but also reduce energy bills as well. So these are the kind of things that we're doing in terms of renewable energy, but it's really, we need to bring the offshore wind, we need to bring the upstate solar down here into the city, and so what we're focusing on is, governor, you have really big goals. There's a lot of solar up in upstate New York. We are half of the state's population, and also half of the state's carbon emissions. The state cannot get to its climate goals without New York City reaching its climate goals. So it's really now a big push to link these two efforts up together. So that's where we are right now. There's one last bit I want to talk about to get to the 80 by 50. There is the next, how do we get to 100? Slightly difficult. We're not there yet. We don't know. But we are developing a carbon neutrality protocol with other cities to share the best knowledge to figure out how to crack that last 20% nut. It is a very difficult thing. We're still thinking about it. We know how we can get to 80 by 50, but carbon neutrality getting to zero is a very difficult thing, particularly when we're thinking about 40, 50 years out from now. So that's where we are, but we are thinking about it today to figure out how we can make sure we're there at 2050. That's it.
Maybe it's a sort of out there question, but plastics emit an amazing amount of toxic and greenhouse gases, right?
Correct.
So, do you have a strategy for reducing plastics?
Yes, we do.
And to that point, is there a capture technology that you've just discovered that could maybe be localized so that less energy has to be shipped in?
So
driving electricity and biogeneration and that kind of really localized energy sources?
Yeah, okay. Yes and no. Let's take plastics first. Plastics is part of the city's overall zero waste initiative. We're trying to send zero waste to landfills by 2030. Part of that is keeping plastics out of the waste stream. We are doing a pretty good job of diverting a lot of the rigid plastics, as you see. There's recycling pretty much everywhere in the city. The diversion rate is pretty good. It's not perfect. We're trying to strategize on how to get there further. We are very supportive of some bills in the city council right now to get rid of plastic straws, which just are not being caught by our mechanical sorters, so they end up in landfills. We're very supportive of that bill. I think Councilmember Espinal also has another bill to reduce plastic waste even further. And so we haven't had a hearing on that yet. I suspect it won't happen for another month or so. But in principle, we are very supportive of reducing single-use plastics. The mayor, we had a plastic bag ban here in the city, which was preempted by the state. I think the governor has indicated he wants to move a bill to ban plastic bags across New York State, which we are supportive of. If it can be done at the state level, it's better. so we are there, and if hopefully with the new political dynamic in Albany, we'll get to a plastic bag ban. If it doesn't, we'll revisit the local legislation that we had here. But it is reducing plastic waste is a big priority, and I suspect we'll probably hear some more about that around Earth Day in April 22nd. But some new city efforts that we're working on right now. Just on the quick
Does that
bag.
include the dry cleaning plastic bags?
I have not seen Councilmember Espinal's bill. If it gets at those plastic bags, from what I understand, though, those in particular have cities that have done some very comprehensive phase outs of single-use plastics. They've had a very difficult time with dry cleaning bags, particularly Seattle, which has the most progressive and advanced single-use plastics policy out there. They had to exempt that. Just the alternatives aren't there, right? It doesn't mean we can't get there. If New York City, if the big market says they're not here, you can't have them here, the market will create this. But we have to do it smartly so we don't hurt businesses, but also balance our climate goals at the same time.
So one of the things that's so important is to get the public service messages out there, and especially in schools. I don't really still feel the impact of what you're doing in schools. There's a big disconnect, and I think that, it's the young people who are going to change their
Sure.
minds. The old people have a lot harder time.
Yeah.
So what is that piece of what you're working on? Because I really don't see any of that in the high schools right now. I mean,
You're absolutely right. I would say what's happening with the city and sustainability, most of our work has been focused at present on what can the city government do that is citywide, and not actually getting into climate education. It is not something that was envisioned earlier on when we were developing our sustainability plans. That is changing now. The Department of Environmental Protection, the Department of Education are working together on a new climate curriculum to teach teachers on what is happening. And
I think teachers just stumble upon that separately. I think it's specific to say the good news about what you're specifically doing in the city. The thing is, trust me, the kids get so depressed about their future. My kids are just despondent about how many things that the earth that they're exactly, they are so depressed because they feel so helpless. What they need to hear is, hey, listen, BMCC just got a whole bunch of solar panels put on top of their roof. Mm-hmm. So, we need those stories we're not doing enough, but give them specific, that's something that you can point to that's helping. And then how many, I don't know what make it tangible.
Got it.
And grade appropriate. And I will tell you right now that many of them want to major in environmental science. They want summer internships. They want to see, what they can do. And if this stuff, I watched 60 Minutes, and they just had this cool story about Tesla's competitor. I hope you saw that story. They have mobile charging, it's like a tow truck, but it's a charging truck that comes around and charges people's, if their car battery is running low, on an app, you order it up. My kid's I want to build that app. That's the kind of stuff. They're quick. So they want to see quick. They want to see New York City be what they saw that China's doing right now.
Okay.
So, does that make sense?
It makes perfect sense.
They're hungry for something real.
It makes perfect sense.
No slogans.
LP, go ahead.
I have 2 things on that are potentially encouraging. So one, the DOE just hosted their first Youth Climate Summit last month, which was organized by high schoolers throughout the city. They put on their own day-long programming around climate change. They're planning to do those ones every 6 months. So that's something to look out for. And also the Department of Youth and Community Development has their annual Ladders for Leaders summer internship program. Which,
my kid did that.
Yeah, exactly.
So but not in climate, but yeah.
So we're working with them this year on a climate track.
Great.
So we're recruiting a bunch of sustainability-oriented businesses and sustainability-oriented teenagers, and trying to work with UICD to make a match. So if you've got a group of students who are interested, I would love to put you in touch with UICD.
Yeah,
Graham.
Great. Thank you.
Graham. Oh, sorry.
Yeah. Two questions.
Sure.
NYC Ferry, diesel powered. NYC Ferry,
Yeah.
diesel powered. In San Francisco, battery electric, battery hybrid,
Right.
hydrogen powered. When are we going to get New York City thinking of transportation on the water in the same way that California thinks about transportation?
I don't know.
Well,
I'll take that question back into the administration.
Also,
that's a good question, I don't know.
Those diesel ferries in terms of air pollution,
Yeah.
particularly in Lower Manhattan.
Yeah, and where they plug in over in Red Hook.
Yeah, just a battery hybrid.
Yeah,
They're gonna be cheaper.
well, we do have now onshore connections for the Queen Mary when they come in. So in order for them to turn off some of their engines, but it's not actually.
That NYC Ferry has a battery hybrid.
I'm not aware of that issue.
No buying, so
All
that's food for thought.
Yeah.
The second
Take that.
issue to do with Lower Manhattan
Yeah.
is the concept of recreate local. In other words, right now, we can't walk on a beach that's down there under the Brooklyn Bridge, but NYC will subsidize us to take a ferry to the Rockaways and walk on the beach. A diesel ferry, I might add.
Yeah.
So the idea that, every weekend in the summer, hundreds of thousands of New Yorkers migrate out for the weekend and migrate back. It's a significant carbon draw that I suspect you're not counting. If we could keep those people in the city, enjoying their outdoors or enjoying the world in the city, that's a savings. I happen to run a free kayaking program here, so I know about recreate local.
Yeah,
I don't see the city doing anything in this, and it's a really multi-billion-dollar savings to the city. If somebody stays in the city, walks on a beach down there, and then goes to Chinatown for lunch, versus going to the Hamptons or the Jersey Shore to get the same experience.
Mm-hmm.
Carbon save, financial save, a lot of saves.
And good for business.
I like the rethinking local. I think yeah.
Recreate, buy local, eat local, recreate local.
My business, I'm doing my business because I didn't want to commute, and I was volunteering on someone's sailboat for 12 years when he left, and there was no more sailboat, so I had to buy a sailboat so I could continue being a dilettante sailor. And so I didn't have to commute, and just one more thing, so I got a whole weekend's worth of whatever by being on a boat for a couple hours.
It was a great idea. The process that we're going through right now, this feeds in.
We're here to help. Go ahead, Richard.
Go ahead.
I used to work for a battery storage company. I know a couple of years ago FDNY actually objected to lithium-based. Is that over? Have they?
We're still working with our local fire department to get over some of these hurdles and address some of the real significant concerns they have, legitimate concerns, but it's still an issue.
And water-based? Are they okay with those?
I'm not down in the weeds on the exact battery technology that we're working through with them, but it is, so we're working through some FDNY issues around security and safety.
What can we do to help with FDNY with battery storage?
That's a good question.
Can some of us take?
Yeah,
Colin, you want to just give us just a little summary here of what the issue is, because some of us aren't quite as well versed as others.
Sorry, we can take it off.
Sure.
No, I think everyone's interested.
I am here for, we work exclusively for renewable energy companies, and lithium-ion storage facilities that Tesla Powerwall, for instance, tend to explode. So FDNY has an issue with them because I think rightly they can cause a fire issue and they can explode. So there are competitors that do water-based solutions and so on and so forth, but I think you can't really have a distributed solution without storage for like Powerwall, for instance, which I think is really the only game in town right now.
They have permitted a few, but it's very individual. The permits are very individual based, situational based.
So for instance, like Australia right now has power walls everywhere, and they're going crazy for it. So every home has, a bank of solar panels on the top of the house, and they have a Tesla Powerwall inside the home, and they're completely off the grid. So there's some, sorry, this is really deep in the weeds stuff.
I know,
but
we love it.
There's some special interests that don't want to see that.
He's got to do a presentation.
Yeah, maybe that's our next presentation.
You're on.
You guys know more than I do, but.
But in terms of going into very specifics about the fire department's concerns, it's very dense here in New York City. If you have something like a battery that technology has a history, or there are instances, potential. I mean, we've had a history of fires in the city. I mean, that's how the fire department was formed. I mean, they're very sensitive to dense spaces and a fire and it taking down more than just the apartment or the house. In Staten Island, where it's more residential, there's more space in between homes, we're seeing some of the permitting happen quicker rather than in a densified place like Manhattan, downtown Brooklyn. I think we're working through the battery companies are coming in and trying to address FDNY's concerns.
Yeah.
We're trying to work through it and trying to convene people through the deputy mayor's office as well to work over it, to get over some of these hurdles. But like, you're right, we need, like the solar plus the battery storage is the thing that's gonna make the difference. And I think there was a question earlier about renewable energy in other spaces. We are looking at very large scale batteries too in order to be able to power down or close some of the fossil fuel plants in
Plants, right?
yeah, peaker plants in Queens. Very large batteries, technology is getting there, but Con Ed has them, is obligated by the state to do about 300 megawatts of that, I think, by 2025. So it's coming, it's coming.
It's really positive stuff.
Can-
It's really great.
Can you give an example of, you talked about Solarize, and you said that you were doing work in, I think, northern Manhattan?
Yeah.
Can you give an example of what that is and how that sort of dovetails to these, are there batteries as part of that? And where are they and what are the projects?
So these solar campaigns are to spur solar in low-income neighborhoods, either for the buildings themselves to be able to power off of solar, or to connect to a wider space where solar may not necessarily be on your building, but you can benefit from that solar. There is very little battery technology deployed in the city to pair with the solar and the batteries, but we are seeing a lot of solar panels, particularly in more residential neighborhoods and parks like Brooklyn. We're seeing a little bit in Upper Manhattan through our Solarize campaigns. We're going to be launching some new ones in other parts of Brooklyn in order just to make sure we get more people aware of the benefits of solar. It is often, these programs are very focused on reducing some of the barriers, and also the financing. So it's making it a lot easier for people to put solar on their roofs in the buildings. So those are the focus of the program.
So it's an educational sort of outreach to.
Yeah, it's education, but also pairing the buildings with the solar developers to make sure that they're talking, and then get the solar on the roof. So we're playing kind of a middleman.
Is it new construction primarily you're targeting, or is it retrofitting?
It's putting
Existing.
solar on existing buildings. That being said, there are a couple bills in the city council right now which are going to look at, I don't know if it's necessarily a mandate at the moment, but they're strongly urging new building to consider solar, or build in solar capacity, and making sure the roofs are themselves capable to hold solar on any new construction. So we're moving in those directions.
There's corporate tax incentives too, right?
Some of it, it depends on the size of the building and type of the building.
Right.
So I'd like to go back to the retrofit question. How much of the 70% savings that you said is in the building, 70% of our emissions come out of buildings, is in current stock versus the new stock? Because most of what you're talking about addresses new construction, new building code requirements and so on. But I don't hear much about, except for this some bit of solar and some few communities, anything about real retrofit of the massive stock that we have.
So yeah, these are what this legislation the council is going to do. It's going to mandate retrofits of all these big buildings in order to reduce greenhouse gas emissions.
And
Just
how is that
commercial?
going to be
It's
paid
buildings-
for?
It's buildings over 25,000 square feet. Okay, I'll start 25,000 square feet. So we have these building mandates that are going to affect buildings 25,000 square feet or over to make sure that they have to meet greenhouse gas emissions of targets.
Okay.
So to do that, you're going to have to look at the entire building. It could be the roof, it could be the roofs, it could be the boilers, it could be the windows. The bill itself at the moment does not say what you have to do to meet the target. Is not prescriptive. It gives a lot of flexibility to big building owners to figure out how to meet the targets by the date prescribed in the bill. In terms of paying for it, there's two things. One, we have in this bill the city's climate goals and our affordable housing goals kind of coming together in not the greatest ways. We have this funny thing at the New York State about if you make a type of improvement to your building, you can pass on the cost of that improvement to renters. Particularly, we don't want to raise the rent on low-income households in the city. So the bill, as I understand it right now, is excluding affordable rent-regulated buildings. So they're not going to at least be part of this original mandate until this law at the state changes. For the private sector, for the privately owned buildings and commercial buildings, how they pay for it, they are going to have to finance it themselves. That being said, the PACE law that I discussed earlier is going to enable financing specifically for these types of retrofits. Very low cost, long term. So it will be very, very attractive.
So what about buildings?
We've seen it work everywhere. A lot of other states.
Right, and the big thing when we were at the city council hearing
Correct.
was that it attaches to the building itself. So if the building gets sold, it's still attached to the building.
Yeah, it doesn't
So
go to the owner.
it doesn't get, it's not an owner benefit, it's a building benefit.
Correct.
So, it was stretched out of a very long period of time at a very low interest rate. That was what that was stressed, at least. I mean, is that what,
Absolutely.
that's the right thing?
That's the right
Okay.
thing.
Okay.
And what about buildings under 25,000 square feet?
So
Is
buildings
that a
are-
significant portion of the emissions, first of all?
It's not as significant as buildings over 25,000 square feet, which are kind of the worst offenders. Under 25,000 square feet, there's a few things. We have a retro commissioning law, which makes sure that any building under 50,000 square feet has to look at their energy efficiency and report that into Department of Buildings.
That's useless.
But new buildings and so it's hard to get at small buildings, right? And we're thinking of ways at which they touch the city at a certain point. That's usually with new construction or substantial renovation, and when someone's substantial or the point of sale, which a bill was passed last year. Like at a point of sale, you have to do an energy audit, and so. And that's going to kick in, I think, 2025. But at the point of sale, you have to say, hey, listen, my building is not energy efficient or energy efficient, and it's incumbent upon the seller to come to an arrangement with the owner or the buyer to make it more energy efficient. So, like, you're getting at that. So, it was like, we are starting with the worst offenders and kind of moving down.
So Gail Brewer's always pushing the passive house standard.
Yeah.
Is that something that's going to be more hardwired into future building suggestions or code, or what do you, I don't know what you call it.
Yeah, so the New York State has its code, and it issues every few years a stretch code to give builders and architects a view of what the future is, and passive house and some of these standards are built into this right now. So we're getting there. It's for smaller buildings. We're having bigger buildings move in that direction as well, but it's going to take a little bit more time before we legislate passive house for everything.
So I imagine you're familiar with the NYC 2030 district, are you?
A little bit. LP, are you? No? Go ahead.
Well, it's attempts to reduce the greenhouse gases of various segments of buildings in local districts. I imagine be something you would be familiar with.
I have to
or
maybe
know about.
some of our buildings, and it's not something that I've heard of. I'm very familiar with. I don't know everything that's going on across the entire administration all the time, or our floor sometimes.
Materials. Building materials.
I was wondering, the new transmission lines
Yeah.
you were talking about, what's the mechanism for planning for those and locating them? Because I know, a lot of times when we've tried to do physical resiliency projects along the shoreline, like in East River Park, you run into these big Con Ed lines, and
Yeah.
that seems to dictate where you can do the levees and the berms and things. So, I was just curious if there's some way to have a more integrated planning process for new lines so that it can happen more quickly, but also more synergistically with other kind of right-of-way, open space, things that need to happen.
Yeah, that's a good question. They have to be permitted first, and where they come down. And I know that there is a transmission line that has already been permitted and gone through environmental review from upstate New York all the way down. It's about being built. In terms of the offshore wind transmission, that is a process we have to work with the state on. It'll be underwater, and where it actually comes on shore, and the environmental reviews that have to go on with that, that's going to be a massive undertaking and process. I can't even tell you when that would begin. But I am sure there are going to be massive amounts of community process, environmental review process around those.
Is that already been pushed to the Army Corps?
No, I don't know. I think these are going to be private developers that probably do some of this. It's the state will put out, they already have put out a request for proposals for the first batch of offshore wind that the Governor Coleman announced a few years ago. But where that is in terms of that, we're still a bit away from environmental review and community input processes.
So I have a couple more questions.
Sure.
You mentioned a deputy mayor. Is there like a deputy mayor responsible for this part of the city, this sustainability, and like who is it?
Yeah, so it's ultimately the mayor, but our office reports into the first deputy mayor, Dean Flahan.
Dean, okay.
But at the same time, so much the sustainability and climate change work writ large crosses over many different deputy mayor jurisdictions. So we are constantly coordinating with the deputy mayor for housing, the first deputy mayor, the deputy mayor for health, the deputy mayor for strategic initiatives and workforce development. Because all these things interlock. I mean, climate change is one of the most it's an all-encompassing problem, right? It's going to take an all-encompassing solution. So we have to get everybody involved here.
Right, okay, and just one more question. Like the batteries you talked about for the solar, like is there an optimum size of the batteries for a neighborhood or something? Like is it more optimum to have each house who has solar panels have their own battery, or is there like a certain economy of scale to having them at a more community scale that could be integrated into a community center and an emergency shelter? Like what's the thinking on this?
Right now, the batteries that we were just talking about with that we're trying to work through permitting with the fire department are more kind of building specific batteries. Mm-hmm. The ones that I was talking about in terms of Con Ed are more kind of large scale.
And what when you say large scale, what is that? What do you mean?
I mean
It's like an 18 box.
Yeah, it's basically it's a semi truck, and they're meant to take over a peaker power plant and store the same amount of power.
So I mean, I guess what I'm asking from an urban design perspective is the city started thinking of what type of building those would go in? Would they be incorporated into parks? Would they be incorporated into hospitals? Like where in the physical environment would those go?
Well, sorry.
Please go ahead. You know
so
the
there's two
battery
different
well.
things here. There's the batteries that go inside a building, which for a regular house is maybe half the size of that wall.
Okay.
What he's talking about is peaker plants, which handle overloads and that kind of thing.
So where do those go?
Those would go probably off near some power plant that we will never see.
But really? But I thought, don't you need it closer doesn't it lose its energy efficiency the further away it is?
Well, no, so the batteries for peaker plant handles overloads. I'm starting to get on my bandwidth here, but handle overloads for the grid. When there's a blackout, the peaker plants basically handle blackout power, and if those go out, the batteries can just substitute for the peaker plant.
Right, but in New York,
We're talking about the distance and then losing the power of the transmission.
I mean, what I'm thinking is they have to be sited somewhere in the urban environment, no?
No.
Well, they'd be right on the transmission wires already.
As long as you're on the wire.
As long as
As long as you're on the high voltage wire.
Okay, all right,
It's the high voltage wire you need.
okay.
We're gonna wrap
Maybe
it
they
up
make
soon,
excellent
but
walls
there's
for
fascinating
berm
questions,
around
but
Lower
yeah, go ahead, Tom. Last questions, last round.
Is Con Ed currently required to buy back energy from like little micro, people who want to
Yes.
Yes.
feed the energy
Yes.
grid?
Aren't all,
I understand
they all
from,
have to, right?
I know they're supposed to, but I understand that they basically make a habit of just ignoring people or making it so impossibly difficult that you give up. I know a few people have tried to do their own little cogens, and
That's my client.
Cogen is slightly different. I can't speak to the internal content process on this one, but
Not for
generally particularly with solar, you can sell your solar energy back to Con Ed. You do have to pay a monthly fee for being able to do that, but at the moment, certainly, that fee is nominal compared to what you're not paying. On any of this stuff, if you want to do a deeper dive, I'm happy to come back. I'm happy to find the right policy project or person in the city government and have him come here or her come here to talk about exactly these issues.
I have one more.
I guess one more question, which is,
That's really
We
one
have a
more
lot.
note.
what can we do here?
Right.
How do you want us to work with you to make this happen in our communities?
Pass a resolution.
So, one is that you want, I would say with the offshore wind in particular, that you want that to plug into New York City. We need that offshore wind here. Talking to particularly your state representatives at the moment is very key. Let them know that you want New York City to benefit from what the governor is talking about in terms of offshore wind. That is, I would say that, and if you guys can do that and direct your energy at the state at the moment right now, that'd be really, really helpful. I do know that many of the state new legislators do want to do this, but hearing directly from the constituents on this one, I really at this moment, I can't undersell the importance of it. So that if I had to say do one thing, it would be that. It would call up your state legislators, say, make sure that offshore wind plugs into New York City.
Is that Block Island you're talking about?
No, the governor announced in his State of the State address in January that he's going to triple the amount of offshore wind the state wants to build for New York City.
Just to follow up on that, would you be able to, I mean, if you're looking that the community board would support this, we would probably need much more information as to what it is that we're really talking about. Would you either, one, be able to come back or send somebody who could talk a little bit more about offshore wind and what exactly
Absolutely.
that entails?
Yeah.
Okay, that would be great, because I'm sure that the community board would, one, want to know about it, and two, potentially be supportive of it. So, at some point, I don't think it's going to be right now, with a tutorial on that.
Yep.
Be good, we're in?
Yeah. I'm going to ask Suzanne to come and brief you guys when you guys.
Who's Suzanne?
Suzanne is one of my colleagues.
Okay,
This is her territory.
great.
So I think along those lines, like, I think we've all heard a lot of big picture
Yeah.
talks. And I think to Alice's point, we would like to know more specifically about what technology, I mean, I'm sure there's lots of competing ideas. There's more than one way to solve these problems.
Sure.
And, I'd like to know how do you vet, what's the next thing? Like, one of the things that you start hearing about is you obviously have to look at the environment. Our environment isn't going to have, I mean, we have wind, it's very windy here. Other places have sun and, this type of thing. But how do you take innovative ideas, which are bubbling up all over the world? I mean, there's even, my kids are watching all this stuff on YouTube, and they're like, why doesn't New York City have the little fan in the middle, so the traffic is going like this, and there's these little cool fans that go down the middle of the street, and they turn all the time, because we have all this traffic all the time. Like, why don't we have that? Like, what do you do to take all these great ideas that are on YouTube right now all over the world that Doha or Turkey or some other place is having? How does that get funneled into your office and then vetted as to, yeah, we can do that in New York City, or no, we can't do that in New York City, and then promoting everything you do like crazy to say, we just did something awesome. And, I just feel like there's a whole marketing component, because the kids are watching this stuff already, and they're upset that it's not in their city already.
Mm-hmm.
Does that make sense?
It makes
Okay.
it's good. It's great news to hear. Like, it's
Yeah.
a really good problem for us to have.
Yeah, and to go to Bronx Science right now, there's 1 million kids that want to work on this problem for free.
Okay. Thank you. No.
All right, so I think we're gonna wrap it up. Thank you. I mean, I think what we'd really love to have you come back also to talk a little bit more about Green New York City and, sort of the hands-on stuff. And also, I think to Wendy's earlier point about the significance of beginning to really educate the kids and teachers, frankly, I mean, to really have that in our schools, because it really is something that seems to be the missing link often, where people really just don't know a lot about it. And so, I would support an initiative. I don't know what the office does in terms of educational outreach to schools, but I would hope that it's more than less.
Yeah, I've a lot of good takeaways from this meeting.
And also, do you have a program for incubators, like for setting up a city incubator for both young kids and you know, into actual professional grade, you know, environmental conservation action?
We have some of that stuff through EDC and through the technology. To go into the technology question, we have the technology incubators at EDC. Each individual agency has some of its own technology incubators in terms of bringing this and road testing it here in New York City. For example, I just want to, like, with solar, like, how do we vet these issues with wind versus solar? Solar, there's not enough space and rooftop and sun angle for solar to be our savior. That's why we vetted that as much as we want to, because solar is a lot easier, it's faster, technology's here, we can put it on, but we have so many shadows. It's just not going to bring enough energy. So we need offshore wind. And we're thinking about what is the population going to be like? What is our economy going to need? You know, we're trying, you know, unfortunately Amazon decided to go somewhere else. But that kind of stuff uses immense amounts of energy. And so how do we make sure that the future economy, how we set up for the future economy and bringing that in? So we vet things like that.
We'll look forward to that more granular, exactly that level
Yes.
that we're all looking
Great.
for. So you'll be
Yeah.
back sooner than you might like.
No,
Thank
no,
you
no,
so
I'm
much,
happy to come
Michael.
back anytime.
I really
Thank
appreciate
you guys
that. It was
for having me.
terrific.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Thank you. Okay, great.
Okay, that was really terrific. Wow.
I do not have that anyway.
So, this is very exciting to have Marcy Benstock. I don't know how many people, I think there's probably a few people here with the gray hair who know who you are. It's like having a legend in our midst. You know, this was a woman who, I'm going to ask for your attention here if you want to take something outside, Bob. Thank you. So I'm introducing Marcy here, who is the director of the Clean Air Campaign, and who's very self-effacing and doesn't like when you say that she's the reason we don't have Westway and, you know, the reason that we have this campaign to save the Hudson River, but she's really one of these people who really is, you know, you're legendary, and I'm so delighted to have you here. She knows everything there is to know about the Hudson River, and it's really thanks to her that we sort of attempt to save it. I suspect this is the person to ask all sorts of questions about the West Side and the Hudson River. It was the Clean Air Campaign founded because of what your concern was about clean air emissions as a result of what might have happened on Westway. Now tell us about it. Okay, you're going to give you take the floor, Marcy Benstock.
Thank you, everybody.
Okay,
Thank you, Michael.
yeah. And thank you.
Oh, so we have something up here with the presentation.
So we have one map up there, and then the other map needs to go near it.
Okay.
Full size, the whole thing.
Okay.
Okay, so, Clean Air Campaign called CAC was founded in the 1970s, actually before Westway was getting going, to get existing environmental laws upheld and enforced, and to improve public spending priorities. Clean Air Campaign engaged in a series of efforts, a few of which I'll talk about that are relevant to the Board 1 area today. But all of them are still relevant actually to people living and working in New York City today, because none of the issues have ever gone away. CAC started as a citizen drive to get the New York City Air Pollution Control Code, as it was then, upheld and enforced in one 200-block area, which happened to be on the Upper West Side, but could be replicated anywhere, by getting every single large apartment house boiler upgraded to burn fuel more efficiently, and every building superintendent in those buildings trained and certified in energy conservation and pollution control techniques. This is the one area of overlap with the speaker who spoke before. The boilers are really important in New York City. The effort worked after 2 years of citizen watchdogs and pushers, combined with a city agency that the Lindsay administration forced to work with us, reduced particulate pollution on the Upper West Side by 33 1/3%.
Wow.
Clean Air Campaign then tried to get all the federal Clean Air Act requirements upheld and enforced, which was and still is a much tougher job. Getting people out of cars and into subways and buses, or walking and biking alternatives is essential for bringing key pollutants down to minimally safe levels for human beings to breathe, and also to reduce the transportation-related emissions that contribute heavily to climate change. Adequate public funding for New York City subways, buses, and commuter rail systems was and is crucial for doing that. So Clean Air Campaign and its allies took on the Westway fight, which turned out to be an 11-year battle to get billions of dollars of federal and state grants reallocated from the Westway Highway and Hudson River Real Estate project to mass transit, to the bikeway and greenway on dry land along the river, and to other essential public needs. Governor Cuomo, then Governor Cuomo, and then Mayor Koch reluctantly agreed to the trade-in alternative, as this was called, reallocating funds to other priorities. But no sooner had they done that than the head of the Battery Park City Authority at that time sent Governor Mario Cuomo a series of memos describing how to extend the Battery Park City development site northward up the Hudson River to 42nd or 59th Street.
Is this Charlie Erstad?
He was a big booster, but the guy who wrote the memos was Sandy Fuscher.
Well before
Your time.
Right.
We're going from the Battery Park City Authority.
And he proposed using different funding sources and a public authority to build a piecemeal patchwork quilt development site in the river, using new and rebuilt piers in some places, platforms, other pile-supported structures, and fills in some parts of the river. Soon afterwards, they started calling this plan Hudson River Park. And that's pretty much where we are today. The Hudson River Park Trust is, HRPT is the public authority that's currently implementing an ever-evolving plan to build and rebuild in what turned out to be the worst possible location in our view, namely the highest risk hurricane evacuation zone in this stretch of the Hudson River. That's a map of just the Westway area, the Hudson River. Westway was to be built between the black lines. And the HRPT authority has jurisdiction now over a much larger site. This is only at the convention center down at that end. The site goes all the way to 59th Street now. And the green space is what most people think of when they think of Hudson River Park. But in fact, the whole project area inside the black lines has been defined as a park in a defined term in state law. And that's the source of a tremendous amount of confusion. After Hurricane Katrina and Superstorm Sandy, the supporters of in-water projects that could be used for development started calling those projects resiliency projects. Obviously, lots of resiliency projects are good, but not in this stretch of the river in the water. Before discussing the harmful environmental impacts of non-essential building in the water, I have to touch on a few facts that most New Yorkers aren't clearly aware of. The hurricane evacuation zones map is put out by the city but very few people that I've come across so far have seen it. Under both Mayors Bloomberg and de Blasio, the city issued these maps. The highest risk zone was called Zone A in orange in the Bloomberg maps, and it became Hurricane Evacuation Zone number 1 in red today. And the whole Hudson River is in red, highest risk. And that area is overdue for a hurricane, worse than Katrina today. As the city's website indicates, hurricane evacuation zones are not the same thing as floodplains or flood zones. Sandy made lots of you all too aware of the huge damage flooding can cause. But there's often a disconnect in people's brains about the other kinds of harms that hurricanes can cause. Gale force winds are the definition of a hurricane. They can topple buildings, down trees and power lines, knock out power, hurl broken windows and other debris into people. During Katrina, so-called floating structures that were used for casino gambling in the water were untethered from their docks, lifted up and hurled inland into an interstate highway where they were smashed to bits. That's one key reason why putting people in harm's way by building potential development sites out in the river is a really bad public policy here today. Or as one regulator put it privately, it's just nuts to build in the river. Now for the adverse environmental impacts from siting non-essential and or non-water dependent projects in the Hudson River or in other public waterways. I'll stick with the lower Hudson's nearshore waters, including the old Westway site, because that's the habitat I know best. The first set of adverse impacts is on fisheries, marine mammals, and other living marine resources that depend on that habitat now, that one right there. When Westway was first proposed, its supporters claimed the habitat in the river where Westway was to be sited was a, quote, biological wasteland, unquote. The opposite turned out to be true. Federal resource agencies found that the area was a crucial marine and estuary habitat for dozens and dozens of species, including but not limited to the famous ones, striped bass, and flounder, tomcod, sturgeon, and many more. Striped bass are an example of what migratory species do and how important it is for them to find the things they need in the habitats they're used to finding them at. Striped bass spawned north of Poughkeepsie, swim down to their nursery habitat in the river right there. In a tough year, 99% of those fragile young stripers die. But the ones that survive swim out to the Atlantic Ocean, at the bottom of the map there, up to Maine and down to the Carolinas. Decades later, the females that don't get caught by recreational and commercial fishermen return to the same location north of Poughkeepsie where they were spawned. And the whole cycle can sustain itself and renew itself forever if man just leaves that habitat in the river alone. Those stripers don't need the man-made wetlands or, quote, tidal marshes that HRPT wants to use fill to build in the river. What those stripers need is a policy decision to let the river be a river. River development supporters often claim such in-water projects promote resilience. The resilience expert that Clean Air Campaign trusts will tell you, usually privately only, that the only 100% effective measure for keeping more New Yorkers safe in major storms and hurricanes is to shift new development away from the coast. I'm not talking about what's here already, which I, for one, would not want to move. but the question is where new sites for development are going to be subsidized. The second big environmental issue is traffic and air pollution. The more that gets built and rebuilt in the river offshore, the more traffic will be generated crossing the West Side Highway or West Street or Route 9A, or going north-south on the highway to get there or come from there, and on local streets. Some of the air pollutants that harm human health also contribute to climate change. So citing development out in the river is moving in the wrong direction. Third are the big picture environmental, health, and food security issues. Because Westway was such a high-profile battle and set of legal decisions, it has ramifications far from New York. There's a phrase in real estate, location, location, and location are what matter. Well, the same is true for adverse environmental impacts. The location where projects are sited is all important. Building out into public waterways is bad for air pollution and climate change, and bad for aquatic habitats, fisheries, and living marine resources. The latter matters most on a global scale, because fisheries are the single most important source of essential protein for the world's malnourished populations. Here in New York City, Bangladeshi immigrants fish for food. The big picture really, really matters here because, as I said, the Westway case was and is so high profile. It's taught in law schools as far away as China. So would-be in-water developers are watching what happens here. The fourth big issue, I'm nearing the end, is spending priorities and mega development issues. Briefly, before climate change and deadly storms became an issue, the HRPT authority was given the power to take in money from any conceivable source, public or private, and then to spend it seeking Army Corps permits and issuing construction financing and other contracts to build out into the critical habitat in the river. HRPT has spent nearly $1 billion so far and proposes to misallocate at least $150 million in public funds in the next year's upcoming state and city budgets, just for one fiscal year alone. That's money that could be addressing our subway or homelessness crises or other urgent public needs instead. Perhaps an equally dangerous funding source that city and state officials have pushed through in the last few years is the sale or transfer of air rights, supposedly unused development rights, from above the Hudson River, public waterway, to upland sites. Lynn Ellsworth and Human Scale New York City have done great work in explaining the TDR, or Transfer of Development Rights, issue generally. But the abuse of the TDR concept, which not only helps mega developers build too tall buildings on dry land, those abuses are even worse when the concept is applied to public waterways like the lower Hudson, which HRPT, the state legislature, and city council have recently done. HRPT has sold alleged air rights from Pier 40 and the Chelsea Piers vicinity in the river to inland developers so far in order to use the proceeds to build and rebuild costly projects out in the river itself. HRPT is currently claiming that only development rights from the air above certain piers in the river will be sold, but it isn't clear from reading the complex package of zoning changes that were put into law in late 1916 that the concept couldn't apply to other waterways around the city and other parts of the Hudson River that aren't
1916 or 2016?
2016, did I say 1916? Just check. Wow. So, in conclusion, the alternative policies that Clean Air Campaign supports involve siting real parks and non-water dependent uses on dry land, not in the water, preserving and expanding treasured views of open water. People love to look at just plain water. reducing the completely avoidable financial, public safety, and environmental risks that go with building and rebuilding in the high-risk hurricane evacuation zone in the lower Hudson, and promoting true resiliency and sustainability with measures that work and don't make existing problems worse than they are already. And finally, spending taxpayers' money on the things we most urgently need. So a lot of this may have been new to you, and I'll stop here for questions.
Thank you, that was terrific.
Thank you.
Thanks.
Well, pick up, Laura.
I think that was really informative and wonderful. I have a question. You talk about siting parks inland, like where there's no place inland to site a park. So what's, people need open space and recreation. So, I mean, what do you think is the solution?
Some of the solutions that are actually being used already are to build on rooftops. The rooftops that we don't want for solar, I guess. And many more infill, like small tot lot size parks. But in addition to that, I've been thinking about what about all the vacant storefronts that, I live on the Upper West Side, and on Broadway, virtually every other storefront is vacant.
That is true, I was there over the weekend. But I mean, what I'm talking about is like the greenway system, because you're talking about the bicycles. I mean, so many people are using this green corridor.
Oh, no, that's wonderful, and I don't know of a group that doesn't support that. And there's room at the edge of the river to have a greenway like that, and that's really good with climate change, because you don't want buildings right at the edge of a river where the water's gonna smash into it the next time we have a Sandy.
But that's infill. I mean, that is the previous.
It was once landfill until the 1899 Rivers and Harbors Act was passed to stop all the filling, because, you know, Congress saw they needed public waterways for navigation. They weren't even thinking so much about the environment or sustaining fisheries. That came with the Federal Clean Water Act in 1972. And after the Clean Water Act was passed and then Westway was defeated, architects and planners were saying there will never be another Westway type fill again. It's illegal and no one's going to do it. And now here, I guess they're hoping everyone will forget and starting to do it again.
Do you have I mean, getting specific, I think I asked this on the phone once, was, you know, on Pier 40, which is, you know, like this beloved place where everyone wants to have their recreational fields. You know, what could you see there? I mean, you know, looking realistically towards the fact that there is development, you have a community that has great need, and this is a very overcrowded city, etc. What do you do with that?
Well, Pier 40, actually all the piers, but Pier 40 in particular, has been the most hotly contested issue by true blue environmental groups internally. I think community residents have a different perspective from, say, Friends of the Earth or Clean Air Campaign or NYPIRG, because they're thinking about, you know, what would we like and how can it be paid for? And they aren't thinking about the habitat under the deck on Pier 40, the 15 acres of habitat. It's not a great habitat, it's pitch black, but eels live there. Eels actually like it there. And so the solution some people in some environmental groups like is to let each, Pier 40 actually has had a huge amount of investment over the years, even before HRPT was created, with replacing piers and recladding piers. There are something like 3,500 piers pilings under there. I misspoke again, sorry. And so some people want existing stable parts of Pier 40 to continue to be used while looking for real alternatives on dry land for the other uses, even the soccer fields, which are the most contentious of all. And then others say, well, as long as it's totally open space, it's okay. And then still others say, and these are the ones Clean Air Campaign disagrees with, you have to have things like office space that are not currently legal on Pier 40 in order to pay for more things in the river. And I just don't see an end to that. If there's ever more non-water dependent uses cited over the water in order to pay actually a pathetic amount, I would say, for more building in the river. And I say a pathetic amount because moving office space, let's take existing office space, moving it from Fifth Avenue to the river, for example, means it no longer pays any real estate taxes ever, and it puts the people working in those offices in harm's way, and is just not a good disaster prevention policy for today. So I don't think more and more non-water dependent uses should be allowed by changing the state legislation. They're currently illegal under the Federal Clean Water Act, but the Corps is not enforcing that or upholding the Clean Water Act properly in its permitting process. But the reason Congress put it in 1972 that only build in public waterways when you really have to was because public waterways are the only resource we have for navigation and sustaining fisheries and other living marine resources, marine mammals, waterfowl, and so on. The whole food web that depends on there being habitats in nearshore waters. Sorry, that was too long.
Not at all. Wendy?
So we're hearing more and more about the East River Park, that the reason they moved the berm from near the FDR, now they're putting it on the water's edge and raising the park by 8 feet and going down to bedrock to work on resiliency, and that the Big U concept is going to be something like this, where because of the water seepage that comes in underground. What's your reaction to that, given what you're saying? You don't want to disturb. Is that what I'm hearing?
We don't want building in the water unless it's really going to be effective, including cost effective. It's really going to work, and is essential for a genuine, legitimate public purpose.
Well, I was going to say, this flood map shows the red all around there, that the
Yeah.
Big U, quite frankly, should go up higher on either side than what we've seen in the newspapers. But the concept from the Big U people are telling us that what they're learning is they need to build, I'm calling it a slurry wall, there's a better word for it, a slurry wall type thing down to bedrock, and that the way to make it cost effective is to bring it in by barge, and that's how it's going to be built in the East River Park. So, I mean, I'm really curious, because I can't imagine from what I'm hearing that that's something you would support, or am I missing something?
No, but getting honest information is essential for everybody. And I don't see that happening from the city or the Army Corps of Engineers.
The honest information piece?
The honest information about exactly what's being proposed, exactly what's where, and what each element would cost, and where the money would come from. And 3 years ago, I went to a wonderful Army Corps, I don't know, conference type thing in Lower Manhattan, at which one guy from Rutgers, whose name I can't find, gave a PowerPoint presentation with the headline, "New York is not the Netherlands." And his point was that things that are claimed to work haven't been shown to work in New York Harbor, which, I mean, it's different. It's not the Thames River going into the ocean. It's not Amsterdam. It's a particular place with particular hydrology and other engineering type problems, and very little has been shown to work. And I think going small first, which may be frustrating to, you were saying, to the little kids who see a great idea on YouTube, but is crucial here, because nobody knows. I mean, the weather forecast for today proved again that it's just really hard to predict these powerful forces of nature, wind and water in particular. Was that?
Well, I'm actually curious though, but, you know, the idea that we're learning about resiliency and, you know, building a berm of some sort, you know, for the vulnerable areas, to your point, you don't want to take any buildings down that exist in Lower Manhattan. But Lower Manhattan, I mean, it's going to flood again.
It'll flood again, although the flooding, I hope, won't be as bad as it was when everything converged at once in Sandy.
Right, but we didn't have much rain.
We didn't need it.
Right, but one can have a heavy rain and not the other things.
Right.
And there can be really bad flooding. Because Lower Manhattan is low. And
So is there anything you'd support is kind of what I'm asking.
things on dry land are almost certainly, at least the last time I looked at one of those big fat reports, a better idea than things in the water. The things in the water tend to be Army Corps' dreams of pork barrel projects, like the ones they used to build in 1950. And no, they don't have the money for today. Or they're, well, I won't go on and on, but all of us need much more information and better experiments and better information also on what has worked and not worked in other places that are at all analogous. And I know the Washington Post had an op-ed from Virginia State experts in 2012 saying there are all these things that don't work. And that's the last op-ed like that I saw. I mean, we're in 2019 now. So there's certainly a lot of big money interests that have a stake in all kinds of things that make it hard to get information that's trustworthy. But I think that's crucial.
Just a comment, about the big things. The Hudson River Foundation had a wonderful lecture just recently about the proposed barrier at the Rockaways, and basically said it wouldn't work. And if you want to get references, it's...
Oh, yeah.
They have that. It was going to completely mess with the Hudson's tide flow, and perhaps actually even cut off New York City's fresh water supply, which is a Poughkeepsie. So those are little gotchas, you know, before we build anything. Be aware of that. Now, I'm a tenant at Hudson River Park. They're not my favorite landlord. I can certainly speak to the boondoggle projects that they build. The fact that they build boathouses on the water dramatically increases the cost, even to run them. Like right now, the thing is heated. No one's there, but it has to be heated or the pipes will freeze. And I have a boathouse where I got 200 boats, but I can't put them all in the water because my dock isn't big enough. And I get complaints from this community board about I'm too crowded. I'm not too crowded. I don't have a big enough dock for Manhattan. I will comment that I've seen that they've been selling air rights for operational budget recently, not just for capital improvements. So the implication there is that every air right they can sell, including those in Tribeca, which is really profitable if they can sell them, they will sell. because they're selling them to finance ongoing operations, not capital improvements. Now, I'm sure that's completely legal, but that's what they're doing.
I don't think it is legal, and the way my evidence for that is at a recent HRPT board meeting. I go to all the board meetings. No one's allowed to speak from the audience, but I take notes. And Madeline Wills said to the board, and by the way, the air rights, the transfer of development rights from the Chelsea Piers area to upland sites just south of Hudson Yards, nobody sued us. And she grinned, she was thrilled. So from that I gathered, it's illegal.
They certainly will be looking at those Tribeca area rights if they can sell. Those are very valuable. Just beware.
I mean, one of this question's often asked of someone who's presenting who has great knowledge like yourself about whatever the issue is, but are there things that you think the community should be aware of and be actively working on? I mean, I don't know that, you know, what that might be, but, you know, are there suggestions you want to throw at us?
I would love to see community board people, if not the board itself would be excellent. I'd like to see it oppose virtually all the money in the city and state, in the proposed city and state budgets for building in and on the Hudson River. And it's a heavy lift, but I mean, when I started fighting Westway, people told me, oh, don't bother, you'll never get anywhere. The forces that want Westway are too powerful, and they were. But after only 11 years, we won. And it certainly wasn't just me, and no one person could ever do anything like that alone. But if more voices, a lot of the people who fought Westway have gotten old, you know, frankly speaking, or they've moved out of the city. And they just don't have the energy they used to have to speak up in every kind of arena. And I think if more new voices spoke up, I think most of the elected officials know that it's nuts and reckless to build in the river, especially for a reason I haven't even talked about. But they're afraid to break ranks and go against Cuomo, and maybe to a lesser extent de Blasio and Gail Brewer. And they're not hearing from new people. You know, they're tired of hearing from me. And so I don't consider myself to be an effective, you know, source of pressure anymore. But I love giving information and sharing information with people who are interested in any aspect of this huge resource allocation battle.
Well, I feel really uninformed because what building is being proposed in the Hudson now?
There were 42 old piers. That's a lot. And HRPT said a few years ago they had totally rebuilt 17 of those piers already. But now they're coming back and saying, oh, well, we need more work again. And that's actually logical because this stretch of the river, even when it's good weather, has highly corrosive salt water, winds, tides, and currents going in every direction. So everything's being battered all the time. So the maintenance costs are really high and growing. Yeah, growing all the time. And the more that gets spilled in the river, the more they'll skyrocket.
Right,
And so the specific projects where money is planned to go, I'm just in the middle of digging that out of letters to public officials and reports online, which are hard to decipher, and so on. And I will have a handy checklist pretty soon at Clean Air Campaign.
Can you give some, though? I mean, isn't Pier 40 considered one of them?
Huge, I think it's huge.
Pier-
oh,
Pier
yeah.
40 is
Oh,
a
yeah.
huge one,
And Pier
absolutely.
55,
Pier
the,
55,
Pier 55, and Pier
Pier
57,
7.
and Pier 26, we have an estuarium that arguably
Well, that's
is,
on land.
well, it's at the,
The building is gonna be on land?
Yes,
It's
Yes,
on the
building
upland.
is
Oh, they
on,
moved it off the pier.
Well, they
Good.
moved-
well, it's on
But we-
the bulkhead.
Yeah,
So,
If it ever gets built, anyway.
but at Pier 55, also called Diller Island,
Yes.
that's a great example of something that was built totally new, right in the river. And for a while, HRPT got away with calling it a rebuilt Pier 54, as opposed to a totally new Pier 55. And they used money from different pots for different parts of the overall project. Like their federal congestion mitigation and air quality funds, ironically, that were used to build access roads to Diller Island, you know, over the water.
but are there new projects coming online? I mean, I thought they were through
Yeah,
building.
no, that one is totally new.
No, but that's
But the
a done
rebuilding
deal.
projects
The-
can be very, very expensive, like Pier 40, well over 150 million. And then buildings on top, depending, oh,
I
yeah,
was gonna say, the reason why the estuarium's on land is because they underbuilt Pier 26. They didn't build the weight for the building they
Oh.
proposed. They
Oh.
actually had plans for the estuarium on the water, they never showed it to CB1.
we,
I didn't even know that.
absolutely, but
They
we
showed
fought
to
it tooth and nail.
CB9 in Upper Manhattan.
They showed it to
good for you.
CBM and we fought it, and we
Well, I
were
have
good.
the copies,
I remember
because they
being
never
allowed
showed
to
them to you, but I found it on the CB9 website, because the architect who did it wanted to do some in the
Yeah.
Harlem River.
ah,
So
yes,
that's when they
yes,
showed,
Harlem on Hudson.
but they had to
was once
cancel
called.
that because they had not put enough weight loading on Pier 26 for a
Wow.
two-story building.
We were led to believe it was because the community didn't want it, but how naive.
But the other thing is, the estuarium building will block sight lines to open water from very far away. And so, only for people, even people who only care about views of the river, it's just a bad place to site an estuarium, which is, you know, classrooms and museum type space and everything. Those things can go at underutilized places that are already existing on dry land. I don't mean sites for new stuff, I mean like, I don't know, the Park Avenue Armory and,
Well, I'm part of the river project, and we gotta be close to the water. That's where it all is.
but you could be right on land, right near the water.
That's the concept of the estuarium.
You're gonna, yeah, I think that, I would say it's hard to get your head around the idea that nothing gets built anymore, you know.
Well, in the water.
Yeah,
I
along the
didn't-
water, I think.
I didn't say, you know,
I mean, it's a great idea, I just don't know that's a realistic
I didn't
position.
say, Clean Air Campaign actually is no longer taking positions on anything on dry land, and I'll consider the bulkhead dry land for this purpose.
Thanks.
But an awareness of all the issues, like the blocking of sightlines and stuff like that, and then having a discussion, preferably in a federal environmental impact statement, which has never been done for this project as a whole, about all the issues at once with honest information, is what has been sorely missing.
It's true, it's true.
I will comment, there's never been a microclimate analysis done for Hudson River Park, the way Brooklyn Bridge Park has done a brilliant Brooklyn Bridge Park, they have put some of the slopes so they're warm in February. You can sit outside on a sunny February afternoon and be toasty. And they looked at the wind patterns and the sightlines of the sun, and they did all that for the various seasons, because most parks in New York City are seasonally used. If you can design an outdoor space to get multi-season use, then you get far more for your park. Brooklyn Bridge Park has done that to extreme. Hudson River Park has never done that analysis.
Interesting.
Yeah, we'll wrap it up pretty soon. Go ahead, Wendy.
So, I have to admit that I have really enjoyed Pier 25, and I really enjoy going out on all these things. So are you basically saying that all of those, Pier 25, I went out before when the pier was old, and I like that. And then they said, oh, it's falling into the river, so we have to rebuild it, so it's closed for, I don't know, remember 2-3 years, whatever, how
There's
many
no
years was
building
it
on it.
closed? 4 years, I have no idea, but it was several
it's not.
years. But are you saying that you would prefer to keep all the old piers there and just wait for it to fall in the, I'm just trying to figure out, like,
Yeah,
'cause,
no.
you don't want it to fall into the river.
No, because that, the Army Corps will tell you that creates a problem with floating debris. And, which
Well, and just
actually is a
also,
real issue.
we
right?
all like to
Right.
walk out on the
Pier
Right.
piers.
25,
Yeah, that's
but
the
Pier
question.
25 is an open pier. There's no building except for a
Well,
small.
there is a golf,
Not yet.
miniature
Yeah,
golf
golf
thing.
No, but you're, you
But I'm
know Pier
saying,
25,
like-
you're not against Pier 25 the way it is, or are you?
But I'm
Because
going back historically, that there was an old pier,
it's curious.
and then they had to, close it down for several years, and they put the new pier in. Is that the kind of thing that there'll be more of those projects in the future, like that example? I'm kind of hearing that you would be against redoing the pier, is that what I'm
But
hearing?
if they were proposing to do it today, I fear I have to say yes. I totally understand. I used to say for maybe 20 years, oh, we love the old piers because people can walk out on them and be surrounded on 3 sides by water. I was saying that.
Right.
And then the Westway case forced me to get into the very long, extensive, but very interesting, I think, regulations implementing Section 404 of the Clean Water Act, which talks about what can and can't be, or is supposed to be built and not supposed to be built in the water. And the issue of rebuilding piers that once were there, I've recently been told, is somewhat murky, although I haven't seen it in the old regulations, but I want to look into it now. But in 1972, Congress balanced things that still need, I think, to be balanced today, namely how wonderful it would be for parents to be able to take kids out on Pier 25, versus the need to prevent the piecemeal destruction of a habitat of extraordinary national and natural environmental importance. And it's considering everything at once that hasn't happened. There's been a huge PR effort to sell the idea of building in the river as a park and sell it to people who want more parks, which is pretty much everybody. And none of the information about what led to passage of the Clean Water Act or what the adverse impacts can be from siting parks in the water as opposed to on dry land, or doing things that are harder to do, like even with the soccer fields. There are a lot of kids who play soccer in New York City who go to fields that are fairly far away. They go to the Columbia fields, on the far Upper West Side, or they go to Randall's Island or someplace. And that's less appealing, certainly, to parents with kids near Pier 25, or near Pier 40. 26 actually has gotten some soccer fields, hasn't it?
No, Pier 26 isn't yet developed. Well, it will have some sort of central open field that we were, as part of its landscaping. But, well, I it's a radical position, but why not? Bob, did you have something? And then I think we'll
The
wrap
thing
it.
is, you seem to be very interested in policy, and you seem to notice a lot of things in the thinking about policy that are missing. So, I'm always interested in how these things work, but that's an enormous question, like how to marshal the kind of intellectual and policy resources and thinking resources to do that. You're starting even with a distrust of the Army Corps of Engineers, just, prima facie, and
Yeah,
so.
it's not prima facie. I've worked a lot with all the federal
But
agencies.
I don't mean to
Right.
go
And-
into any one thing,
Right.
I want the big question looked at, like, how can we put together the kinds of perspectives and resources we need to even think the
Yeah.
right way about this?
That's a big question that I think about almost every day, because things have changed so much since we started fighting Westway in the 1980s in particular, when there were really smart people who had the time to bring resources like the ones just in this room to bear on these policy questions, and they were interested in doing it and motivated to do it. And I'm thinking of like a great sculptor named John McNally, who's dead now, who was an engineer. He'd been in the Marines, and he did great scale models of, what would be bad about Westway. And there were stay-at-home moms, as they were called back in that day, whose kids had just gone to school, and so they wanted to be volunteers with Clean Air Campaign, but thinking about the challenging things that their PhDs had taught them to think about, and while getting training in how to run a nonprofit advocacy organization. So all these free resources were there in the 1980s that either are not there or are there in smaller pieces today, and how to find the people who are interested in all the different aspects. I mean, one of the things that interested a small group of people who were really smart and loved reading documents was the abuses of public authorities. And
We would all agree with that.
And there was a wonderful report, which I'm dying to get online sometime, or maybe it is online, but probably not, which was called the Furek Commission Report on Public Authorities and Corporations in the State of New York, Underground Government, and then some more words. And it talked about exactly how public authorities do everything we're seeing today. We're seeing the MTA do some of them, and HRPT do a lot of them, and Empire State Development do even more of them. And the extent to which, if you find the right document or the right gray-haired person, you can start aggregating useful information is unknown to me. And I don't know how you find the people. That's part of why I'm here today.
I know you are. So,
Yeah,
we
yeah,
had this conversation. I think it's very true. I think there's very little public advocacy. We accept when Madeline Wills comes and says, well, we can't afford to do it any other way, so put a private ferry on the end of the dock and, let Citibank have it. I mean, we accepted it, sort of with a little bit of noise, because there's really no group who's going to actually challenge, is this really legal? Which it really isn't, because, 3 people on our board who are working full-time, may not have time for it.
Yeah.
And so I continue to applaud your efforts, though we may not fully support, every one of them, but I will hope that you would keep us very much in mind and send information when there's something that you think that the community should know about. This is the place it should come.
Well, budgets are policy. I mean, I can't stress that enough. As Dinkins once said when he was mayor, budgets are policy. And the big resource allocation issues in the city and state budgets are billions. It's not, the million or so that a community board may get to opine on. It's billions. And finding just a few more people. There used to be a wonderful person, and then they couldn't get funding anymore, who did wonderful monthly reports on post-Sandy proposals and what neighborhoods weren't getting the money they were owed and stuff like that. And that was a project of an organization in Washington called Good Jobs New York was the New York outpost. They were related to Fiscal Policy Institute, and then a Washington group whose name I've forgotten. But then they didn't get more funding, and she's gone.
Yeah. Well, we're thankful you're still around and you're still, with the campaign. And, again, I really thank you. I think we're,
Yes, thank you.
really terrific to have you. Really, really appreciated it. And, keep the email exchange open. Thank you very much.
But as I told you, our office has to move, so I'll be pretty much out of pocket for the next few months.
All right, well, we won't badger you until a few months are up. Okay, thank you all very much.
It was a
Yeah.
wonderful meeting,
Yeah,
thank you.
really great,
Yeah,
thank
great.
you for all coming.
Last
We had a
question.
full house.
When do we get to start writing, resolutions about,
All these different areas, well, I couldn't agree with you more, but I think this is, we're getting the
I
information.
know we're learning, I know.
Right, so, but, yeah, I mean, when you've got a burning issue is when you want to write the resolution.
How about one on
No, I
supporting the
don't.
banning of all
Because
plastics?
she has
I
supported
mean, that's great.
rebuilding.
I think that's exactly it.
And
I think
so,
the recorder is, I can turn it off.
even though I like